Here we go. Okay, so we are recording. And so I will officially open our event by expressing my gratitude that we are able to gather tonight. I believe most of us are gathered on the shared unceded territories of the Squamish Nation and the Lil'wat Nation. We are very lucky to live, work, and play on these territories. And I think tonight we're going to have a great chat about how we can garden on these territories. For those of you who may not know me, my name is Jeanette Bruce. I'm the program coordinator at Whistler Public Library, and I'm only going to talk for another minute, and then I'm going to hand it over to our official speakers this evening. Like just a couple of little Zoom bits and pieces for you. We will have time for questions at the end. If you want to submit questions using the chat box, you are welcome to do that. That's usually located on the bottom of your screen. But just know that we're not going to answer the questions until the very end of the session. So you can submit them whenever you want, but we are going to answer them at the end of Claire and Christy's presentation. And of course, when we get to the end, when we get to the Q&A portion, you would be welcome to unmute yourself to just ask your question out loud. So you will know when the time comes for your questions. And thank you to everybody who submitted questions ahead of time. I'm really sorry if they got trapped in the limbo of my inbox, as I believe many of you have heard already. The RMOW server is totally down this week, so our inboxes are unavailable. So apologies if you submitted questions that I have not received. I promise we'll have lots of time to answer them tonight, so fear not. And I think that is it from me. I am really delighted to be here tonight with Christy Auer, who has, she's no stranger to gardening talks at the library. She has facilitated or participated in a panel discussion in previous years. I know that she's got a lot of expertise of her own, but Christy is also going to be in conversation with our other guest. I'm gesturing as if she's right here. Claire Goss from the Brew Creek Center, and Claire is a horticulturalist there. Ooh, that's a tongue twister. But I will let Claire tell you all about what, sort of the ins and outs of her job is. So without further ado, I am going to stop talking and I am going to let my guests take it away. Thanks for being here.
Sure. Thank you. Christy, do you want to go first and introduce yourself?
I certainly will. Thank you, Claire. Great to see you. I see you've got lovely blooms in behind you, right? My name's Christy Auer. I've lived in the Valley for a long time. I always wanted to garden. My dream was to surround my house with a garden, and I have. And I had a friend for the longest time used to say, and you're the one that wanted to go back to the land on a ski resort. But you know what? I did, and I've enjoyed it all the way. So when I spoke to Claire and we were talking about how we were going to set this up, I said, it's the expert and the enthusiast. I've done it for a long time and I love to do it. And I love to encourage other people to do it as well. I live down in Pinecrest as well, though, which a lot of people in Whistler like to refer to as down south. We are 500 meters lower than Whistler. And yes, we are a bit down south. Go ahead, Claire.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Christy. So I've been gardening in Whistler for 12 years. I started off as a horticulturalist at Nicholas North Golf Course for a couple of years and got a lot of great experience there. And that was the first time that I have ever landscaped in this climate that we're in here, which can sometimes be challenging. After that, I worked for the RMOW on their horticulture team for a couple of years. And then I started my own small business for landscaping. And my major work that I do with that is down here at the Brew Creek Center, where we have quite elaborate landscaped grounds. And I've been here for quite a while now. And it's so whilst I wouldn't call myself an expert, I definitely have a lot of experience in the Whistler Valley and knows a lot of the challenges and stuff that we have in this climate. It's, gardening is such a dynamic thing. It's always changing. Each season is always different to the next. And whether you're a professional gardener or an enthusiast, I think the most important thing is to have a bit of a passion for the plants and the landscape and the garden. And, so long as you have a little bit of passion, you can make it work.
Sure. Absolutely. And you told me last night too, it's been 11 years at Brew Creek. That's 11 years of garden.
Yeah.
It's great.
Yeah.
So
And sorry, go ahead.
go ahead.
No, I was going to say with 11 years at Brew Creek, it started off pretty slowly. And as this place has grown, it's become a more and more full-time thing. And I feel very lucky to be able to have a full-time job where I get to immerse myself in the plants day in, day out. It's good for the soul.
Yes, absolutely. So Claire and I thought that the best way to do this is just to sort of break it down to I know definitely from the one other chat that I did with the library is that most of the people who were in the room were experienced gardeners. And so you may very well be that yourselves, but you're here. And we felt that we called it garden basics for success for landscaping. And what we wanted to just discuss briefly were soil, sun, exposure, landscaping style, planning and record keeping, how to purchase plants and garden, and then finally finish it off with some garden do's and don'ts and some of our personal favorites of things that we like to use in the garden. So Claire's going to start off and she's going to talk about soil and the importance of having great soil.
Okay, so the soil that you're planting in is going to be the basis of your garden. If you're going to have any success with plants being healthy and thriving, the soil needs to be right for what you're trying to do. And depending on what your yard is like, what you're doing, if you're planting in planter pots, if you have a rocky landscape, if you have a swampy zone, you're always going to want to plant the right plants that are suitable for that soil. Now, soil can always be amended and changed, and over time you do need to add nutrients to your soil. But I think if you have a particular zone in your yard that you're trying to alter, really try and work with nature, not against it. If you have a swampy zone, plant the plants that like that. If you have a really dry zone, plant drought tolerant plants. It's always, you're going to have better success if you're working with nature rather than trying to fight it. And saying that, so if you're having a really tough time with your soil, you can always get it tested and sent away for a professional analysis that will give you all your nutrients and macros breakdowns and tell you what you need to put into it. That can take a lot of trial and error out of amending your soil, because often we amend our soil, but unless we know what we're actually amending for, just throwing a whole bunch of nutrients at it might not always be the answer. But I think that's really, I would do the soil testing maybe once you've exhausted everything else. Like super basics, like every year I would top dress with compost. I would buy some nice compost blend from like your local garden center, and around your plants, maybe put like an inch or so thick, just spread it all out. And every year that's going to add more nutrients. There's so many beneficial bacteria, mycelium, and all this that lives inside of that. That's really going to enrich your soil. If you are going to be adding fertilizers to build up nutrients in your soil, I always absolutely only recommend using organic fertilizers. I think that's really important. And I think there is a really great trend shifting towards using only organic fertilizers. They tend to be much more gentle. So it's not like adding, you get these like liquid nitrogens and things that's like adding steroids to your plants. Yes, you get a big wow factor right away, but it's not sustainable for the plant and it's not sustainable for the planet either. And there are so many wonderful organic items, even in our local garden centers. So I would always recommend that. And depending whether it's for annuals, shrubs, perennials, there are different products you use. One of my staples go-tos that I use fertilizer kind of for everything. There's a company called Gaia, which makes wonderful organic products, and they have bags they call it Glacier rock dust. And it's what it is, it's Glacier rock dust. And it's just this dust that you sprinkle in and mix into the top of your soil. And it's very gentle, but it's gold. I think it's absolutely something that anyone could add to their yard at any time in the season, preferably the spring, but you're always going to get a great impact out of that. And then another thing that's really important for your soil is sometimes mulching, especially in the fall and things like that. If you have deciduous trees and you have leaves lying around, it can be really tempting to rake up all of those leaves and throw them out in the garden waste to kind of clean up. But if you lay all of that beautiful organic matter over your ground and let it decompose a little, it's going to be really great. You're going to see more worms in your soil, more natural like microbial activity, which is only going to be really positive. And just one last point with soil basics is I would like mention your irrigation. So depending on what you're doing and things like that, what you have in your garden, if you have irrigation systems, the more water that's going through your yard, the more you're going to be leaching nutrients from it. So you may need to amend more. So
sounds great. And the only other thing I'd maybe add is that locally we have quite a few people who you can get soil from, right? Like Coast Aggregates, High Country, and this guy's soil. So if you need to order soil or purchase soil, there are ways you can get it delivered to you. And if you need a yard of soil, right?
Yeah, I believe like High Country out of Mons Road, they have a few different soil blends there. See the Skype in the Rutherford. You know, if you have pickup truck or if you only need a few bags, you can go up there yourself, or they absolutely deliver on small trailers, large trailers, whatever.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And 1 yard of soil is actually quite a bit of dirt, isn't it?
It is, and a bit later on, I was going to talk about when you're planning a garden, knowing the volume of soil you need can be important. And there's, you can just Google really easy calculations on your square footage and the depth and get soil. One thing I've learned from my experience in garden is I always seem to need more soil than I anticipate that I need.
Right. But I like your idea of also, making the most of all those deciduous tree leaves and things like that. And even before you even got your soil, you could be getting those in a place where that when you have it, you've got it ready to start mulching, whatever. Because I know that compost bins with food waste are not possible in Whistler, but certainly you can be using, you can have a compost bin with garden waste and leaves, right? And creating mulch.
Yeah.
No, that sounds great. Well, the thing that the next topic was sun exposure, and we're considered Whistler. The area is zone 4 or 5. But as we all know, that in the Whistler area, that if you're in Tapley's Farm, it was called Tapley's Farm for a reason. It was in a riverbed and fertile soil. And if you're living in Alpine, well, some of my friends say the nights stay cold all summer long. So it can vary wherever you are. But the zone that you're in is an important factor because certain plants are just not going to thrive if you try and plant them, or you're going to have to spend so much time protecting them, you'll never really enjoy them, right? So one of the things to do though is when you are looking at your garden space or where you're landscaping is to how much sun exposure do you have? And if you want a sunny garden, you want a lot of bright colored flowers and sunflowers and things, you're going to need 6 to 8 hours of sunshine. If you have maybe 6 hours in the morning and 6 hours in the afternoon, you're considered a sort of it's not a full sun garden, it's a partial sun. And if the sun never reaches to your garden, again, you're in shade, right? So again, like I really like Claire's suggestion, that is work with nature. If you've got that kind of a garden, well, maybe you have one sunny spot for your sunflower, but the rest is maybe going to be more of a type of woodland garden or whatever, right? More shade. Also to consider that if you have the ability to take care of the trees that are on your property, don't let them get too tall. Start working with them before they do, because they eventually, where I live, the trees have grown a foot a year and now are 30 feet higher than when I first moved here. I've lost a lot of sun. So consider that limbing, taking care of trees beforehand, negotiating with your neighbors, whatever. Also too, if you do have large trees on your property, they're going to create real dry zones, so that therefore you're going to have to take care of the soil and water more there and things like that. So also when you are working with a garden, I would say when you're thinking about the sun and maybe you're trying to plant it, take some records, start to watch. How long is the sun staying in that spot? Is this particular part of my garden really windy? You're not going to plant something you really want to see first thing in the spring, where the snow dump is going to last until maybe June. You know, where are you looking at your garden from? Do you have one particular spot in your house that maybe that's where you do view your property or your garden? Is that where you're going to make a all year round garden? Or maybe it's going to be a spring garden, something that you want to see where the snow melts off first. Those are other considerations, but also too, just being observant, taking some notes every 2 hours, watching where the shadows fall, where the sun is, where it is, doesn't fall. It's important. It makes sense to when you start to plant. And also too, you can have almost microclimates around your own home. If you've got like a large wall or a fence or something like that, they're going to create little pockets of warmth. Well, okay, maybe if you didn't have a super sunny garden, but you can focus on that, you can grow some of those things in that garden, right? But again, too, really paying attention to what you've got and working with it makes, it is definitely going to help for success. And then we've decided to just briefly sum up after just sort of, again, too, getting to know what you've got and what you're working with. Kinds of tools, what things that we need. Oh, well, the other one was too, is also water. If you're just starting out with a garden or a new house or something like that, or maybe you have an existing house and you've been tripping over hoses for just too long, you can set up an irrigation system, you can set up a drip system, but how you're going to water is important, because a regular watering system is going to make all the difference in your success, right? And for Claire and I, we decided that if you're setting up your tools, you're going to need a spade, a rake. A cultivator is one of my favorite tools because I can hook things that I can't bend over and get. A trowel, a hand cultivator, a weeding tool. And a lot of these things are just in an old pail that you just sort of walk around your garden with. And if you've got a wheelbarrow and a corn broom, clean up after. And the idea is that you have these handy tools. They don't have to be the most expensive. Clips as well. Clips are probably one of those things that you're going to be just working with all the time, right? But all these things they're not super expensive, but they definitely are tools that you're going to need to get into your garden and work. Go ahead, Claire.
Okay, thanks, Christy. And just with that list of tools, I have my own gardening business. The tools that you mentioned, I actually have very little more than what you said. That is really kind of all you need. So I'm going to just chat now about planning and record keeping. And so with that, so planning a garden, so whether you're starting from scratch and planning a new garden, or if you're looking at maybe renovating a little bit of an existing garden, just a couple of things that you might want to keep in mind. So firstly is where you're going to get your inspiration from. So if you're looking on like Pinterest and Instagram, places like that, and looking at beautiful gardens, please just always keep in mind the zone that we're in. So our zone kind of cusp of 4 and 5, it is a little bit limiting with what we can grow. So even like down in Vancouver, some of the gardens down there are amazing, but we can't grow half of what they can grow down in the city. So when you're looking at pictures of gardens that you find really, really inspirational, just have this like expectation versus reality that a lot of that stuff might not be available here. But in saying that, there are hundreds, thousands of beautiful, gorgeous plants that you can put in your landscape that will be successful in our climate. You just need to make sure that we're choosing for the right zone. So if you're on the Google and you're looking at plants, zone 4, zone 5, make sure that your plants are going to be okay with that zoning. And another thing when I say kind of expectation versus reality is that gardens, they take a long time. If you're starting a garden from scratch, a garden really is an investment in the future. Someone once said, there's a quote, it's kind of cheesy, but I like it, that to plant a garden is to have hope in tomorrow. And that means that you plant a garden now, it's not going to come into its full beauty until probably a few years from now. And unless you can have an instant garden if you want to throw a ton of money at it and buy really mature established plants, you can have an instant garden. But for most people, the reality is you buy plants that are small and you start there, and over time, those plants grow and develop and fill in. And that's where your garden comes from. It's not something that just happens tomorrow. You're investing in your future when you plant a garden. It sounds kind of cheesy, but it's true. And so if you have existing plants in your garden, they don't have to be where they are. You can always dig up a plant and move it somewhere else. You don't have to be stuck with what you have. And, unless it's like a huge big tree or something like that, plants can be transplanted. Spring and fall is the best time for your transplanting. I tend to say fall is maybe a little better than spring, but you can absolutely still do it in the spring, earlier spring. And also too, if you're looking at your garden, like look at what natural features you already have in your garden. Like what can you already work with? It's always more beneficial to, if you have a big rock in your garden, rather than trying to take that rock out and plant something there, why don't you make that rock a feature and have something growing around it or up it? If you have, part of like a viewpoint of, maybe don't plant a big tree where you're going to block your view. You always want to work with what you have. And what Christy was saying before about your sun and light exposure, if you have an area in your garden, the side of your house where it's full shade, just because it's full shade, you can still have an amazing, beautiful garden in that full shade spot. You just have to pick the right plants for it. And it might not be a brightly colored flower bed, but you can have beautiful, rich foliage colors and textures that are just as interesting and more natural looking than a kind of real formal garden bed. Know what your budget is. Plants cost money, and if you've never really shopped for plants before, and you're looking for plants, go to your garden center and have a look at what those different plants are and figure out how many plants you need for your area and what you can put in. And plants vary, like something that comes in a 1 gallon pot, which is pretty standard, depending on the variety, the price can differ exponentially. And your garden center staff, they're always going to have great recommendations and be able to help. I think planting perennials are a really great idea. So the perennials are the plants that you plant once, and then in the fall they die back and they're dormant all winter, and then in the spring they grow up, in the summer they flourish, and then they die back again. But when you plant these perennials, every year they get bigger and bigger. So after a couple of years, you can actually get that plant that you bought 3 years ago, and you can dig it up and you can cut it in half with a shovel, and now you've got 2 plants. So whether you're wanting to add more plants to your garden or give a plant to a friend, so long as you pick all the weeds out of it, that's a really great thing that you can do. And in Whistler, there's the Garden Centre and Function, there's High Country. There are like really great local places that have a really great selection of plants. You can go down to the box stores like Home Depot and Canadian Tire, and they have plants too. From my experience, the big box stores, the quality is not the same. I would buy local if you can. And then another thing to keep in mind is where you're placing your plants is you always have to think about the future. This little shrub that you just bought that looks really cute now, think about what that shrub's going to look like in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. Is it an appropriate place to plant it? So this little foot tall thing that you plant in the front of your garden bed, in 5 years time, it may outgrow its space or start shading out something else or just be inappropriate for that place. So I think one of the keys to planting your garden is look 3 years, 5 years, 10 years in the future, and try and imagine, close your eyes and imagine what that garden's going to look like when everything is bigger and filled out and fuller and bigger. So that are probably my kind of takeaways for planning your garden.
Sounds great. And it's like my asparagus that I just planted in my garden, and then I reread the information about it and realized that the 2-meter fronds that need to stay up all summer long, that asparagus got moved immediately, right? Because it was in the wrong place, right? But I think that's one thing about gardening that you have to be, you understand that you're working with nature, and that provided that you're taking care when you're moving things around and all the rest of it, that yes, you can change it. I think that Claire covered quite a bit about that, and sort of the two topics, landscaping and planting and record keeping, are pretty much, they're all a lot of the same information. One thing Claire didn't mention, and she had told me that at the Brew Creek Lodge, she's kept records, and that's important. If you buy a shrub or a rose or a lilac tree, it's going to have a tag. You probably are taking notes. I recommend that when you're planning a garden, you sit down and you try and draw a drawing. It might not be great, but you'd be surprised that how you can work things out. Again, too, thinking about the size of things, looking at the terrain of the land, but also as you purchase those plants, just file them away, keep them in a box so that you can always refer back to them, because it might be something that you've had great success with and you'd like to share that with someone else, but you've forgotten the name, right?
Yeah.
As well as we've all got our phones in our pockets, take pictures, create your own Instagram account on your own garden, whatever. But the idea is that you'd be surprised, first of all, what great gratification you're going to have by looking at those things, but as well as how we forget. And that sometimes that'll spark an idea where you'll say, you know, that could be moved, whatever. But for me, I would say that for why landscaping is that I think we haven't mentioned COVID yet, have we? But we all know it's here and it's affected us. What is a landscape? And why? It's something that is beautiful, right? Or maybe it's exciting, but or stimulating, but it is something that you're going to go and gaze upon if whatever your inspiration is. If it's you want a classic landscape, you want I have an incredible book called Japanese Zen Gardens. Do I want that small, that Zen look? Do I want to replicate something I've seen when I've hiked up Singing Pass? But this is why you're doing it. You're recreating this beauty of nature, as well as it's going to give you solace. And it's something, as well as you're going to work on it. You're going to spend years, maybe, like a great big painting, taking a bit off, adding a bit to it. And in the end, you're going to, at the end of the day, you're always going to sit and look at it. And that's, and landscaping, you're enhancing the earth. You're creating very often habitat for wildlife, animals, birds. You're increasing your real estate value, but more than anything, it's creating beauty and giving you, and I believe, great satisfaction and solace. And we need that.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I feel extremely lucky that I get to spend half the day with my hands in the dirt.
That's right.
One thing actually that I forgot to mention about the planning of your garden is thinking about your long-term maintenance. So, I mean, people like Christy and I, we're happy to spend a big chunk of our lives with our hands in the dirt, but maybe you're not willing to do that. So when you're looking at garden inspiration and wanting to build your gardens, think about how much time you actually want to spend maintaining it. Maybe you're happy to spend every single weekend spending half of your Saturday in your garden, but maybe you're not. Maybe it's something that you don't have a lot of time to dedicate to. And I would definitely choose the look of your landscape and plant specifics based on how much time you're realistically going to be able to spend maintaining it. Not all plants are created equally, and some things are really high maintenance and some things are zero maintenance. So I think that's something to take into consideration as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And again, too, that's where more, if beautiful shrubbery using rock and all the rest of it, and even turf or mosses and things like that, that is going to be your Monet's garden. That's what that's very much something that you should have an idea of, right? And explore that with yourself, right? Same thing is that often I think sometimes people have a tendency maybe to take on too much, maybe plan it so that in stages, so that you, again, too, if you only have so much time, manage so much of your garden, knowing that next year, once that established, and maybe you have more time, you'll work on it, or maybe you have help, whatever. But the satisfaction of accomplishing what you've done is definitely the goal, not looking out and saying, oh my God, so much work to do and I haven't done it, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, often these more kind of like native shrubs, perennials and things like that, they're going to suit the landscape well, they're going to be successful in our climate, and they're going to be lower maintenance, which I think is a great recipe for success. I think it's sometimes, it's nice to have that really good, strong basis of your garden of these native plants that aren't so high maintenance, but, maybe you do really want that exciting pop of color and a little bit of flashy factors sometimes, and there are, whether that comes from like annuals that the plants that you just buy once and then they last for the summer and they die in the winter. That's great for like planter pots, you know, maybe not super sustainable to fill your garden with that every year. It's kind of a little bit wasteful throwing them out all the time. But if you have a couple of like bright spots where, you know, maybe close to your seating area or by your front door or something like that, you know, like a couple of pots full with some annuals, that's going to be just like bright color for the whole season, right? So that's pretty easy, you know. I'm going to just touch briefly on like spring blooms. So right now it's the spring, all the daffodils and tulips, this is like their time to shine. And they're a little bit more work. You know, you plant the bulbs in the fall and they flower the following spring. Depending on the variety, some of them perennialize themselves, some of them are just like a one-use shot. But the bulbs are really nice because this time of year when the garden's still just waking up and you look outside and there's not much happening in your garden, right now is when the daffodils and the tulips, it's like their time to shine. And I think it's a really nice welcome to spring when, you know, sometimes on these dreary spring days, there's bright yellow daffodils staring at you when you walk outside. I find it very uplifting. And things with daffodils, you can plant them once and you can leave them in the ground and they'll come back for several years.
Yeah, I agree totally. So should we talk about the do's and don'ts, Claire?
Yeah, all right.
How about watering? What's your recommendation for watering when you're working in the garden?
My recommendation for watering is not to just have in your mindset routine that I water every second day for this amount of time. I think you should always go stick your finger in the soil, and if it's dry, water it, and if it's damp, leave it. I find with my experience with doing some of the residential contracts and stuff in my time, people I find tend to overwater more than they tend to underwater. So that's wasteful with water, but then it's also not great for your plants to be overwatered either. I find if you have an automated irrigation system set up, I find most people that already have one, lower it a little. As a general thing, people are overwatering more than they want. And sometimes with plants, if you actually wean back the water a little bit, the plants adapt to that. They don't actually need so much. We live in a damp, wet climate anyhow. But if you're ever in doubt, go outside and stick your finger in the soil. Stick it like halfway down, like 2 inches deep into the soil. Is it still dry 2 inches deep? Yeah, give it a good water. If you stick your finger in, it's damp in there, leave it and check it again the next day. And I find it's better to water deeply and thoroughly less often than to water a little bit every day. If you water a little bit every day, you're just watering the surface. The plant roots, you want the roots of the plant to go down into the earth to be strong. So if you give it a good soaking once a week, that water really gets to penetrate the soil and go down. And that's where the plant roots are going to go, because the plant roots, they're looking for the water. They'll go deep into the earth to look for it. And that's what we want. If you give it a little sprinkle every day, the roots are going to stay shallow on the surface, and that does not a healthy plant make. It's my 2 cents on watering.
Sounds great, right? Yeah, no, that simple finger in the soil test sounds like a pretty simple way of figuring that one out. For protection for plants, I think that it's like a lot of things. Spring bulbs, things like that, they're adapted to come up in the cold, even in the snow. But particularly in the wintertime, when you're cutting down your stalk and things like that, it's not recommended to cut it right down to the base. Leave at least a foot of the stalk up, mulch with leaves and brush and things like that. It actually sometimes I'll even leave goldenrod and certain things, leave them up, or even the daylilies, some of them, because in the winter it makes an interesting landscape, and it'll all be taken out, cleaned up in the spring. And I find for myself personally, I particularly with vegetables, but I've done it with plants and everything else, remade cloth. It's like a white cloth. You can buy it at any gardening center. You can pretty much spread it over anything. You can use it, weight it down with rocks, or attach it to things with clothes pegs, whatever you have to do. But it is amazing. It'll raise the temperature underneath it by 5 to 10 degrees and just protect things. Again, too, if you're maybe seeding things, you can put the remade down. The remade will just keep that soil just not quite as dry when you water it. The water doesn't penetrate the same way. It just is like a little tiny film of protection that will, it's nothing and can be used over and over again, and very, very handy to have. Doesn't look great sometimes first thing in the spring, you know, it looks like your garden's kind of shrouded, but it does make a huge difference, right?
It really does. And another thing with cutting back your plants in the fall with your perennial plants, I think it's better to try and leave it as long as possible in the fall, so that once we start getting like frosts in the morning, when we get a heavy frost, that's going to be a killing frost, and that's what's going to turn your plants to mush, basically. I tend to try and not cut my things down until we've had those killing frosts. If you're cutting the plants down before they get their killing frost, they're still putting their energy and nutrients outwards into the plant. Once they get that frost, it starts putting their energy back into the root system. So it means that the end of the fall, your garden's going to look a little brown and mushy. So it's not the most aesthetically pleasing garden practice, but it's the most sustainable gardening practice. And then a lot of people too in the fall, they'll like landscaping companies and things, like not all of them, but you rake up all your leaves, you rake up all your cuttings, and you take it all off site to a compost facility. I like to think it doesn't look as nice, but leave it in place. Like leave your leaves when they fall on the ground, rake your leaves up into piles over your plants. And that's going to be natural mulch. It's going to help protect them in the winter. It's going to help amend the soil. And then in the spring, you have to do a spring cleanup anyway. So you just take that all that stuff back to the composting in the spring, leave it there in the winter. It's natural protection, mulch. Unless you have a show garden, you can do that on a residential level for sure. One of the other things I was going to mention about if you have shrubs and pruning your shrubs. So depending on, different plant varieties can be finicky with their different pruning techniques. I would say, just as a very kind of general rule of thumb, any of your shrubs that are flowering, so whether it's maybe an azalea or even spirea, Philadelphus, any of your flowering shrubs, roses even, the probably correct time to prune them and cut them back is right after they're flowered. So whether it's something that flowers in the springtime, like your azaleas, right after they're done flowering, that's when you clip them back just a little bit. Your spirea that flowers like later on in the summertime, as soon as those flowers are faded, then you cut them back. I feel like a lot of people sometimes wait until the fall to cut back their shrubs, but a lot of these flowering plants, once you cut them midsummer, they start putting out the new growth, and that's what they're going to flower on the following year. So, this isn't true for every single species, but just a general guide would be cut your flowering shrubs directly after they're flowered.
Right. And what about bulbs, Claire? When your bulbs have bloomed and are starting to die down, so many people want to know what to do. My personal solution to bulbs is I grow hostas in the same bed that I have my bulbs, so that I don't have to do anything with them. The big leaves of the hostas cover the bulbs.
And that's a wonderful combination, because the bulbs are in flower in the spring when the hostas aren't showing anything out, and you get that great use of space, right? So you're not having a blank section in your garden at any one point. There's always something coming up and down at a different time. So with your basic daffodils and old school kind of classic tulips, if you plant them in the fall and you leave them there, and if you want them to perennialize and come back every year, don't cut them back. So you can cut, if it's a tulip, you can, if you want to cut the flower and take it inside, cut it, but just leave a good portion of the stem so that stem can die back naturally. Because when they're dying back naturally, they're putting their nutrients back into their bulb, which is what's going to give them their energy to flower again the next year. If you cut that tulip off at the ground because you want a nice big stem in your vase, then you've cut off that plant's energy source, and it's not going to be able to regenerate very well. In my experience, daffodils perennialize a lot better than tulips. So you can put your daffodils in the ground, and if you let them die back naturally, they should keep coming back every year. If you want a little more success with that, you can deadhead them. So once it's flowered, once the flower starts to look a little mushy, take it off so that it doesn't form a seed, and that's going to let the plant save even more nutrition. Not a big deal if you don't, but it's a little bit better for its nutrient holding if you can deadhead it. And then that greenery over the next month after it's flowered, it's going to go brown. So wait till it actually turns naturally brown. If you can just pull it off at the surface of the soil without having to cut it, perfect. But yeah, once it starts to turn yellow and brown, then that's when you can kind of get rid of it if you're wanting to perennialize them, which I recommend because they're beautiful.
And would you, when you'd mentioned it briefly, but if let's say you've got some really big perennials, when would you recommend splitting them?
Yeah, so that's one of the beauties about perennials is that they keep getting bigger and bigger and you can divide them and get more and more. I tend to do my dividing of perennials in the fall. You can absolutely do it in the spring. I was doing some today that I missed doing in the fall. But so in the fall, I would say around about that time of those killing frosts, when that natural dieback is happening, I would cut it, a couple inches above the soil line, and just with a good sharp shovel or spade, dig around in a big hole. And it's not the most graceful thing, but I just get a sharp shovel and I just stomp on it and cut that plant right in half, or quarters if it's even a big plant. And then you take those other chunks out and you find somewhere else in your garden to replant them. And the reason why I do that in the fall rather than the spring is once you cut these plants, and it's going to be a bit of a weird shape, but if you plant it, when it grows back in the next spring, it's just going to grow back in like a new plant. When you cut them up and divide them in the springtime, they'll absolutely still live and you'll still get a nice plant, but the plant, the shape could be a little mangled from slicing it in half.
Right.
Yeah, but it's very easy to do. It's definitely not in any way plant science dividing your perennials. I've seen YouTube tutorials where it's really in depth and they make it really complicated. It's not. Cut it in half with a shovel. Now you've got two plants. So, some plants take better to it than others, but most of your garden basics like hostas and daylilies, things like that, they're pretty hardy. They can take it.
Right. And I think you and I had joked about the fact that the day when you look out in your garden and there's something that you just realize is in the wrong place, it's really important not to move it on that scorching hot day, no matter how badly you want to move that, because you'll probably kill it. The idea is that I remember we had that beautiful sunny weather at the beginning of the month. Everybody was enjoying it. It was a great time to move around dirt and clean up the garden, but there was no way I was going to touch anything in my garden. I needed rain. I need what we have right now, this cool temperate weather that if you move things around, they're just going to be able to manage better. They're not going to look like they're dead all day long and then finally revive in the morning and the evening, right? I think another thing too, maybe it's one of the obvious things, but I keep a West Coast gardening guide in my garden, and because it doesn't matter how ratty and dog-eared or wet it gets, because when I do go and plant something, I'll either look it up on my phone. I find the West Coast gardening website excellent, actually, just to sort of remind yourself of depth for a seed or how to plant something. And the same thing goes for when you go to the gardening center and you've had just the most wonderful time and found what you wanted. Don't bring it home or leave it in your car or leave it in your garage or wait 2 weeks until you finally plant it. You're not doing those plants a favor. Read the directions, soak the pot, dig the hole the right depth, fill it up with water, amend the soil, do all the things that you're going to put that beautiful new perennial into and give it the right start, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Another thing, just pretty briefly, is annual flowers. I definitely have a soft spot for all the bright colors in the garden, and you can go to the stores and you can buy annuals for your hanging baskets and planters and things like that. But there are a lot of annuals that are really, really easy to start from seed that do well in our short growing season. There are things like little mini sunflowers, calendula, nasturtiums, cosmozinias. These are all things that are really reliable seed starts, where you can go to the store and you can buy your $3 packet of seeds, and you can plant them directly into the garden after frost. So I would say like after May long weekend, you can put them in the ground, and by the end of summer, you're definitely going to have flowers. If you have like a sunny windowsill or spot like that inside your house, you can absolutely put them into like little pots and put them on your windowsill now and then plant them out once the frost has passed. And I find sometimes, doing these little things from seed, it's such a rewarding thing, just tying a little seed and then getting flowers from it. And it's nice, you know, having these little pops of color that you can intermingle in your garden. You know, I'm definitely a sucker for flowers. And these are definitely some really easy, kind of almost like foolproof ones that anyone can plant these seeds and should have some success.
Yeah, I totally agree with Claire, and I like to use that. And one of my favorites, I love the naturescaping. I want a garden that if there was no home here, someone would walk into it and think, oh, this is a beautiful meadow, or these rocks are an alpine look, right? And so I find I use a lot of foxglove, columbine, lupin, goldenrod. I'm from Ontario. I need goldenrod in the fall. I have a 8-foot, well, they're not 8, that's an exaggeration, 6-foot patch of goldenrod that makes me feel very happy, right? You know, so it's, again, too, these are naturals. I can share them now. I've found them on roadsides. I've brought them back from Ontario, things like that. And, but again, too, you can use the roadside flowers along with what you've got, and to make that kind of garden that I think is quite nice. But what Claire, though, does down in Brew Creek, how many dahlias did you put into pots?
Almost 400.
400 pots of dahlias. Okay, tell us about your dahlias.
Dahlias are a beautiful, very showy, very prolific flower. They're also very high maintenance. So I think dahlias are a wonderful, if it's sunny, you need a lot of sunshine to get your dahlias really going. But one of the things I like about dahlias is that you can keep them year after year if you deal with them correctly. So they are very frost sensitive. So in the fall, as soon as there's that first killing frost, they actually turn to black mush overnight. And then what you have to do with your dahlia, they grow from tubers, and they get these little clumps of tubers. You need to dig the tubers out of the ground and store them for the winter. So the best way to store them is just, you know, dry them off, brush off some of the soil. It doesn't matter if it still has some on it, and just put them in a cool, dark place for the winter. So it needs to be somewhere that can't freeze. So usually the ideal temperature is around 5 degrees. So if you have a garage or a basement or something like that, where it's just cool and dry, you just put the tubers under there, and then in the spring you bring them out. So most people would bring them out, and you'd maybe plant them in the ground maybe 2 or 3 weeks before the last frost. You can put those tubers in the ground. I'm lucky enough here at Brew Creek, I have a greenhouse, so I can put them in pots and start them in the greenhouse several weeks earlier to get a jump start. But you can plant them directly. They're just going to be a little bit slower to start. But they are very rewarding, because once the dahlias start blooming, they just start pumping out the flowers. But that can also be high maintenance, because unless you're deadheading them, they're not going to produce as much. They generally always need staking because they get tall and the flowers are heavy, so they flop over. So again, the staking is a bit more work, and they're also heavy feeders. So if you have a garden bed, if you put dahlias in the same place every year, you will absolutely have to amend that soil, because they will take a lot of nutrients out of it. But they are a very spectacular thing to behold.
When do your dahlias start to bloom down at Brew Creek?
You know, there's all different varieties, and dahlias come in every shape, size, and color you can even think of. And I want to say, depending on the year, the earliest dahlias, I want to start flowering at the very end of June. Last year it was a little later, because last year it was a very cold, wet June. So I don't think I even got flowers until the start of July, which was late. But even though they're later in the season to start flowering, they will keep pumping out the flowers until that killing frost. So down here at Brew Creek, you know, I can say like Thanksgiving, that's borderline, but I've still had dahlias at Thanksgiving before. In Whistler, some of my houses up in Whistler, a little earlier, I would say kind of the end of September is when they're done. But the nice thing about the dahlias too is that, you know, you just buy the tuber once, and then every year that it gets bigger under the ground, and you can divide them. So one year you might have just like one little potato tuber, and then you pull that out of the ground in the fall, and you could now have 5 of them, and then you can divide them up, and then next year you've got more plants, so you can give them to your friends or create a bigger gardenscape with the dahlias. They make a wonderful cut flower. So, and because they do need that constant deadheading to keep producing, they're a wonderful thing to have in your garden if you like to have flowers in your house. You know, if you like walk through your front yard and you snip a few blooms and put them on a vase inside, it's great because you get cut flowers, and that's also beneficial for the plant to keep producing as well.
Yeah. Well, no, wonderful. And that's really when a lot of your perennials have finished off, you've got these gorgeous dahlias.
Yeah, so the dahlias are they're definitely like a kind of a showstopper in the garden, I would like to think. And I'm just going to share a couple of my other kind of more favorite like sun plants that are flowering. And this is more like perennials and things that you just plant once and come back. But there are wonderful ornamental grasses that you can buy that are really low maintenance, things like Carl Forester that get like tall and upright, and you know, they get these beautiful like seed plumes on the end of it. Unfortunately, we can't grow pampas grass in Whistler. Pampas grass is very fashionable right now. It does not suit our climate. I've tried because I've wanted it to work. It doesn't work. But you know, Carl Forester, the plumes aren't as big, but it's still a real big statement piece you have in your garden. And they don't die back until well after the frost. So they're a really good fall feature you can still keep in your garden once everything else is done. Various types of sedum is really well. Like, so sedum, they tend to flower like later in the summer, generally a full sunspot. And there are many different types of sedum. Autumn joy is one of the most common, and their clumps, they actually get quite bigger every year. You can probably divide your sedum in half every year and get multiple plants off your sedums. The black-eyed Susans are a real staple in Whistler. Shasta Daisies are native, beautiful midsummer flowering. The echinaceas as well, gorgeous. Coreopsis is also a native flowering plant. They kind of look like little yellow daisies, very fine foliage. They're very delicate looking plant, but very hardy by nature. And there are things that can wonderfully be incorporated into, I think, any kind of sunny garden. Another one that's really great, and I think a staple in a lot of gardens, is Lilies Hemorrhage. They're pretty much unkillable. So for anyone that's kind of starting out with gardening, they beautiful lush foliage, showy flowers. Again, you can cut them in half every year if you want to. And I'd be hard pressed to find someone that can actually kill one of them. Christy, do you have some favorites?
I'm just thinking that we've talked an awful lot about flowers and not too much about shrubs. Okay. And one of the, but I would think that for landscaping, obviously there's the evergreens and whatever, but Japanese maple do very well in our climate. And if you want a kind of a showpiece type of shrub, I think that's one of them. And I have some lilac that finally now are 15 feet tall, and I can give away my lilac blooms, and it's been worth the wait. Right. So it's shrubs take longer, but I think you can again too, you can accomplish great texture and even color, year-round color with by choosing them and by growing them. And if flowers aren't your thing, and there definitely is lots and lots of scope for that. And then the only other plant that we didn't talk about too much, but which I really do like because I love the varieties, and especially when you let them get really big, are hostas, because again too, they're still a little wild, right? They still blend in with all the background of your forest garden. And again too, once they're large, they establish themselves, and they're very reliable, right?
Thing with hostas as well, they are absolutely meant for our damp, cold climate. That's what they like, so they thrive here. And there are so many wonderful varieties of hostas.
Yes.
You know, one of the big nurseries I go to, they probably have 50 different varieties. So you can get bright lime green, blue toned, variegated. And even though they're a shade plant, they can really brighten up a shady corner. Hostas are a staple.
Well, and they're a perfect ground cover for, like, with shrubs, things like that, right? You know, and it's yeah, and they can be, and you can eat the tips, I've heard, but I'm not going to do that. They seem like taste like asparagus.
Interesting. Just, you mentioned Japanese maples before, and yes, I think Japanese maples are wonderful they absolutely do work in Whistler. Sometimes they do need a little extra protection in the winter, depending on the varieties. So maybe choose where you plant them. You know, if you're planting them maybe closer to like a fence or somewhere that it might be a little bit protected. Definitely don't plant it anywhere where snow is going to slough off your roof onto it. And then another thing with the Japanese maples is sometimes if it's a younger specimen or it's a newly planted in the wintertime when there's heavy snowfall, I would go out there and I would shake the snow off it so that it doesn't build up too much and cause a lot of weight, which can cause breakage. Another good care tip with the maples is, you know, once they start to grow, if they get quite dense on the inside, is pruning out some of the inside branches so that rather than the snow building up on the canopy, the snow can actually fall through it. And that just helps with the weight on that.
Yep.
Yes.
Sounds great. So what do you think, Claire? Is there anything else we need to talk about, or should we let Annette take over?
Christy, I could keep talking about gardening all night, so I think we should probably stop before I do that.
I don't know the time. Do you?
You know what? It's bang on 8 o'clock.
It's 8 o'clock on the nose, and we do have a couple of questions in the chat, so we could run through those. And pardon me, I can't remember. Have you addressed the questions that I sent to you ahead of time?
I think we covered most of them in there.
I think they were probably incorporated in there.
Yeah, I know that there was definitely a question about protecting maples, which we just went over. We had someone ask about like favorite shrubs, especially natives. And just a quick list of native shrubs that are really great would be like native dogwoods, Mahonia, which is also called Oregon grape, beautiful shiny leaves and little yellow flowers. Different types of roses, like Nootka rose is, I know Christy has a beautiful, massive Nootka rose at her place. Ninebark, and ninebark is a wonderful foliage shrub that actually comes in many different colors and does really well in our climate. And snowberry gets those little white balls in the fall and they're really fun. There are some natives, but some non-native ones that in terms of shrubs that I think are amazing are hydrangeas, viburnums, spireas, berberis. Stop me because I'll keep going. We did. What were some of the other questions? We had a question about flowering plants, and I did mention some of my favorite flowering perennials. And then also another question was when to divide and move things. And I said I recommend fall or spring, but fall generally.
Awesome. Yeah. Okay, well then let's dive into the questions we've received tonight. The first one is from Wendy. Thanks for your question, Wendy. And she asks, could you make some recommendations for low maintenance, lower sun, and then in brackets she says morning only, plants that still offer some color?
Okay, so low maintenance plant that only gets a bit of morning sun. So I would say one of your best bets for color would be something that's a striking foliage. I mean, you can definitely find some flowering plants that will work for that, but like we were saying before, like some of those hostas, you can plant a dark green hosta next to a bright blue hosta or a bright yellow hosta, and you get that contrast, and that's beautiful color. There's another plant called Bernario or Jack Frost, which looks very much like a hosta, but has silvery leaves. It's like a bright, like iridescent silver on the leaves. And they even get a little spray of blue flowers on them, and they don't need a lot of light to really produce either. And so I think in these kind of conditions, that's when you're going to look for your really kind of striking foliages. There's a beautiful grass. It's not native. It's actually a Japanese grass. I'm going to destroy the name, Hakanakolahala. It's a weird grass, but it's I will look up the name and send it to you right now, but it's a beautiful, striking, fluorescent yellow and green, low-lying grass, which contrasts against anything you put it against. Christy, do you have any others?
I like the hostas, because another thing too with the hostas, if you do have a place that you know it's in the springtime, it's probably going to be at its sunniest again too. You can brighten it with bulbs, things like that. And then other than that, and some of the geraniums too, you know, the different kinds of creeping geraniums and things like that, they'll often tolerate shade. right? And still flower, and they'll have a nice, they'll mat out nice and fill in with an interesting leaf and all the rest of it, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Thanks, Claire. For those of you who are not watching the chat, Claire just popped the name of that Japanese grass in the chat for everyone.
I can't pronounce it.
That's okay. I'm assuming it's spelled right, so people can Google it. The next question in the chat is from Karen, and Karen asks, from Seed of Sky, I assume soils, which blend would you recommend to add to my garden under a fir tree and it therefore gets quite dry? Would you recommend premium potting mix, Nutrimulch, garden blend, or organic compost?
I would go with either the organic garden blend or the compost. They're going to be the two richest ones. Anything that's a potting mix is going to be mixed with perlite or vermiculite or something like that. And that makes it lighter in area, which is what's really better for like seedlings and things like that. So that those potting mixes, they're actually designed to have better drainage. And if it's an area that's already dry, you want less drainage and you want more moisture holding. So the compost and the garden blend is what's going to hold the most moisture in there. So I would even do a mix of the two.
Okay. Next question coming up is from Mark. Mark asks, could you teach us a thing or two about planting bulbs? How deep do I plant them and which are your favorites?
Okay, so bulb planting. So different bulbs like to be planted at different depths. They will always have the instructions on the packet, but when in doubt, however big the bulb is, plant it twice as deep. So if you have a big allium bulb that's the size of a big onion, you know, that's going to go 12 inches in the ground. If you have a daffodil bulb that's maybe 2 or 3 inches high, that's going to go 6 inches in the ground. So, or tiny little crocus bulbs that are only, I don't know, 2 centimeters high. They only need a couple centimeters on top of them. So general rule is however big your bulb is, put it twice as deep as the size of the bulb. They often, bulbs come with kind of quite finicky instructions. Dig a hole and put the soil on it. You know, it's bulbs are pretty hardy because a bulb, all the nutrients it has for that plant to grow is already in that bulb. It's more just about protecting it from like the freezing and things like that. So sometimes when I've been planting bulbs in my garden where the soil is actually not deep enough and there's rock and I can't get it 6 inches deep, I can only get it 4 inches deep. I still put it 4 inches deep. 95% of the time they still work out just fine. Sometimes if they're just planted shallow in the spring and frost heave can work the bulbs out of the soil. And also too, if they're not in deep enough, then the critters can get them. But
what about bone meal, Claire? Do you put a little bit of bone meal in when you plant your bulbs?
I don't do it at the time of planting, but generally every year when I'm amending my beds, I use a mix that does contain bone meal. So the bone meal, you're really just kind of adding calcium to the soil. So the 3 main plant nutrients like nitrogen, phosphate, potassium, the next major nutrient is calcium, and that's what you're getting out of your bone meal. It's absolutely beneficial in your garden for the most part. The thing is with bone meal and any of the calcium supplements, it takes a long time to it become available in the soil. So, you know, you put the bone meal in, it's not really doing its thing into the soil until months later. It's definitely, it's a slow process, a crucial process, but a slow process. So I don't add the bone meal at the time of planting. I just do it in my general amending throughout the season. But to put it in is beneficial because you put it in the fall and it has kind of all winter to kind of sit there. So in the spring, when the temperature warms up and all the microorganisms warm up, it'll start to break down and process it. So that is a beneficial thing to do, especially bulbs can be heavy feeders. If you have bulbs coming up every year, they can take nutrients out. So it is important to put that back in. And bone meal is great for that.
Yep. And another thing I think too, it's important when you mentioned about the 6 inches, it's like, well, all packets of veggies or seeds or whatever else do have directions. It's important. It's very important to read them. And also too, sometimes when maybe you're doing a mass planting like that, it's not a bad idea to just measure off 6 inches on a little stick. And when you're stick it in the ground, because sometimes when you're eyeballing things, no, it's not 6 inches because if you can't dig it that deep, that's one thing, but it's just like anything else. If that's going to give the bulb its best start, well, that's what you work with, right? And it's just sort of another tool to make sure you're accurate.
Mhm. Yeah.
That's just a great policy in life. Never trust your eyeball. Or at least I don't trust mine. I have no idea, even like, the little rule about this being an inch. I don't know if that's true or not.
It's sort of like the eyewitness thing.
Um,
It doesn't work.
Yeah, exactly. We've got lots more questions, and I do want to just mention, because a few people came in late, we are recording tonight, and I will be sharing the recording. So fear not if if you came in at 7:30 or a few minutes late or anything, don't worry, I will be sharing this link, so you'll get all of the juicy information afterwards. The next question in the chat is from Annabelle, and Annabelle asks, do you have any plant or shrub recommendations for slope stability that are low maintenance? And the slope gets half afternoon sun and has rocky soil. Very
Mhm.
specific.
Mm.
The first things that spring to my mind are native things like salmonberry, thimbleberry, dogwoods, shrubs that are going to get in there that can probably deal with low nutrient soil in a harsh environment because they grow naturally in those environments, but they're shrubs, so they're going to get a root system. So the main thing you want to do to stabilize a slope is get plants with root systems that are going to travel. But yeah, I mean, it's tricky. One of the slopes that I have here, which isn't great, every year I throw a few buckets of soil at it and I throw a bunch of handfuls of wildflower seed and things like that in the hopes that things are going to take and naturalize. And over years, things are taking and things are naturalizing, but it wasn't an instant fix.
And it might even be an idea to get a bit of natural rock and try and make a few steps and ledges and then work with that, right? Because then the roots have somewhere to get under and grow around, and it'll be obviously more aesthetically pleasing, right?
Yeah, you know what? One plant that you might want to Google, it's called Iberis or candy tuft. And I know that does really well in that kind of environment. Yeah, Iberis or candy tuft. I'd look that up. That might be a good one.
Awesome. The next question, any tips to get sweet peas to grow from seed?
I have a tip, and so sweet peas, the outer shell of the seeds is really tough and really thick. So sweet peas benefit from either soaking the seeds in water, so soak the seeds in water for a few hours, and that's going to help soften that outer coating and let germination happen a little easier. If you don't have time to soak your seeds in water for a few hours, I roll them between sandpaper. So I'll get 2 bits of sandpaper and I'll roll the seeds, and it basically just damages the outer coating that's on the seed, and that helps up speeding germination. So that's how you can help germinate your sweet peas. But once they are germinated, sweet peas, they grow quite deep roots, and so they don't love being transplanted. So if you can plant them directly in your garden, that's great. Rather than planting them in like a little pot and then moving them out, they don't take to transplanting that well. And you can, it's just if you can plant it directly in the ground, they are fairly cold tolerant. So I would pop them exactly 1 centimeter under the soil about 2 or 3 weeks before your last frost. And then by the time it's germinated and poking through, you might only get a couple of light frosts and they can handle that.
There's an absolutely fantastic book in the library too, the Whistler Public Library. I don't remember the exact title, but it shows a seed pack right on the front, and it was probably one of the most explicit books I've ever looked at of anything and everything on how to start seeds, cuttings, or anything else. Really straightforward, wonderful drawings and photos, right? So it's sometimes I was quite surprised. Again, too, they talked about the abrasiveness on the seeds, soaking the seeds. I read things that I had never heard of before in my life, right? So it's all possible, right?
I had no idea there would be such a specific answer about sweet peas. This is great. I'm learning so much. We have another question in the chat, which is, how often should you use fertilizer on your garden flowers?
Okay, so if you're talking about annuals, like things that you're either growing from seed or little annuals that you have in pots and hanging baskets, I usually fertilize them every 2 weeks with an organic solution that company I mentioned before, Gaia, that makes, I'm not sponsored by Gaia, I just think they make wonderful products. So Gaia, they have a product called, I think it's their Bloom one, and I think it's a little bucket, and you just add like a teaspoon of this powder to your watering can, and I just give it like a little tinkle every 2 weeks, but only once your flowers have started. So if you've started, and Kim, I know Kim is growing some beautiful flowers from seeds. So once your flowers have set their buds, then I would start using that solution. I wouldn't start fertilizing them with a bloom building solution until they get their buds, while they're still just in their growth phase and the plant is growing. If you wanted to fertilize then to help the foliage growth, you would fertilize something that was a little higher in nitrogen. And then once it starts showing buds, then you start using something that's a little higher in phosphorus. But once it starts flowering, then I would say around every 2 weeks, I would put that solution on it. A little tip with anything that's a liquid fertilizer, even with the gentle organic stuff, is make sure the plants are well watered first. Don't water them on a really dry day. I would, if you know you're going to fertilize the day before, give your plants a really good drink the day before, and then come in the next day with the fertilizer. It just, if the plants are dry, if you put fertilizer, they can just suck it up too much and it can be harsh on them. It's just a bit more gentle.
Sounds good. My daughter just passed on to me from Duncan, BC, that comfrey leaves, nettle, and a little bit of organic compost or manure mixed in water makes a great organic fertilizer. I didn't know I could use my comfrey leaves that way. I've tried the nettle and all the rest, but I've got a lot of comfrey leaves that could actually be dumped into that bucket too. So and like you say, it's just something just to top things up and give them a little boost, right?
And that's, yeah, and comfrey is really great to use in your compost tea. I'd say one thing, if you are fertilizing flowers, and I was referring to just more annuals, I don't really tend to fertilize my perennials too much at all. But when you're fertilizing your annuals, if you get into a schedule of constant fertilizing, they're going to need it for the rest of the season. And if you start doing something regular fertilizer every 2 weeks, and then you cut it off, you'll notice a decline. So just if you're going to go into that, it's going to be a bit more of a commitment. I mean, the plants, it's not going to die or anything if you stop fertilizing it. You'll just notice that, the plant's going to get big and strong with all this extra fertilizer and start pumping out the blooms. And then, it's like, like same thing for us. If we all of a sudden stop taking all our vitamins and we start eating really poor nutrition, we don't do well either. So yeah, keep that in mind.
Our next question is relevant to my interests because I told Claire before we started that I killed a rosemary plant this year. There's a question here from Anne asking any tips for success growing herbs, either from seed or maintaining ones already growing.
Christy, I think this is more you.
Let's see. I think rosemary, where we live, is hard to keep alive. So don't feel too bad, right? If you're at sea level, I was in Tofino last summer and I brought home armloads of rosemary that was growing at the back of the hotel rooms, right? Because it just was thriving. It was bushes. But for me, for growing herbs, the ones that are going to grow very, very well around here and even naturalize are oreganos, lemon balm, mints, the chives, right? I love sorrel. French sorrel is a sour little leaf that just 3 leaves in a salad just brightens it, and it's like chives. It's going to come up early spring, and it's green, and you can eat it like your nettles. And again, too, with I found that with my herbs that I had them on a very sunny slope with a lot of rocks, the oregano roots go deep, and the oregano as well, when it flowers, it has the white or the red flowers in it. It's a bee attractant, and it's really quite beautiful. You chop it down, you dry it, whatever. But for herbs, once they're established, they really do well, but they do like the sun. They don't need a lot of care. And I think that sometimes too, if maybe you're trying to get a little herb garden started, maybe the best thing to do is start it in a great big pot on your patio so you can manage it. Or if you do have a spot where you want to designate it as an herb garden, and one little herb plant looks just so small, sometimes buy two, group them together. Then you've got a little more substantial plant going there. But
Yeah.
my husband has made some very interesting barbecues with just whatever he picked out of the herb garden. And it's a great thing to have close by and to dry and to have whenever, right? In Pinecrest Black Tusk, where I live, somebody must have tossed an oregano plant over the bank where brush was tossed. I was just looking around it the other day, and literally there is oregano growing in mats, a meter wide. Some of it is 3 inches high. It's May 1st tomorrow on Saturday. So it naturalizes and it's food.
For them, the question that was asked earlier about the person that had the unstable slope, oregano is actually something that you could totally
That's true. That's really true. And it's beautiful because and you can let it go. And you know, it's a magnificent weed, really, right? And so no, it's true.
Yeah, and the thing I'll say with herbs is for everyone that has ideas of growing beautiful lush basil plants in Whistler, unless you have a
grow it in a greenhouse.
Yeah, unless you have a sunny window or a greenhouse, basil is a heartbreaker in our climate, unfortunately.
And the slugs like it too.
Yeah.
Mine has been languishing on my windowsill. It's technically still alive, but it's not doing very well. I have no shame. I have my little spider plant that could, and I have my sad basil. I'm trying. We have, somebody says they have to go. Thank you for being here, Leslie. And we are coming up on 8:30. We do have time for, a couple more questions if anybody wants to pop them in the chat. I think there was a question that maybe came up on Facebook about bears. Are any landscaping plants going to attract bears, or is that more of a concern with fruiting plants or veggies maybe? Any thoughts on that?
I think it's mainly berries. I've never had a bear go into my vegetable garden. I've had many bears go into my compost heap, but for the most part, no. The bears, and I think Whistler has made the decision to not allow compost heaps, and many of the fruit and berry bushes and things like that is mainly because there's been a mandate to coexist with bears in Whistler, and the two things don't mix. So the berries have to stay on the sides of the ski runs, and the bears can go wherever they want.
I've had bears before with like rose hips. So in the fall, some rose bushes produce big juicy rose hips, and I've had a bear destroy a garden and getting in there for the rose hips. It's only happened once, so maybe it was a once off. But if it is a concern, just when those kind of berries, because a rose hip is a type of berry, just pick them off if you can. Pick them off. For anything, rose hips and things like that, there are so many wonderful home remedies and uses that you can use them for yourself. So don't leave them for the bear, get them yourself. But otherwise, I would say bears they like to eat dandelions, and there's not really a lot of, I think, any of the plants that I've mentioned in any of our listed that I've ever seen a bear eating in my life. Whenever I've seen bears and working at Nicholas North and things like that, there's always plenty of bears. I've never seen a bear in the landscaped grounds eating anything. They're always on the sides eating the dandelions and the more natural stuff.
I guess in theory, if you had a lawn and you had clover planted, that could maybe attract a bear, but that's not very common in Whistler, as I understand it.
I mean, clover has a lot of nectar in the flowers. It is really sweet for bears. There's a couple of different types of clover. And I know one of them, I know the Sea Sky Invasive Species Council absolutely does not recommend, but there is another one, can't remember what it is, but I know there is one that is okay. But maybe you have to check the variety.
Sue says in the comments that composting is allowed, but it cannot draw bears, so it needs to be well managed. So and she says no fish, no bones, etc. So
you know, Christy was saying earlier that with your compost pile doesn't have to be your food scraps. So you can make a compost pile out of your garden clippings. So rather than like that comes out of your kitchen, you know, when you're pruning, when you're deadheading, when you're weeding, that can go in to a compost pile. Right. Well. Not going to be an attractant.
Well, it is 8:25, so we're almost at our end, and I do want to plug a couple of things before we go. I was hoping to have an event to tell you folks about. We are planning an event with Auer about vegetable gardening in May. However, I don't have the details on me. They're probably being held hostage in my inbox right now. And so hopefully we'll be announcing that event next week. But I believe it's going to happen around the May long weekend, and it's going to be part of the Go Fest lineup. So, you know, it'll be sometime on the May long weekend. So stay tuned for details about that. But speaking of Auer, I do want to mention that they have great online resources for gardening, and most of their resources are focused on growing food, but a lot of the concepts still apply to your landscape gardening. So I have a couple of links I'm going to pop into the chat. The first one is just awarewhistler.org/grow. That's where you'll find a lot of the good info, awarewhistler.org/grow. And then we actually have a partnership that just launched. We have a new seed library. And so
lovely.
Yeah, it literally just hot off the presses today, but it lives at the library. And right now it's a very small bank, so we're actually looking for donations of seeds. So if you want to contribute seeds to it, that would be absolutely wonderful. But the idea is that eventually it will be a library from which you can take seeds or contribute seeds, and it'll, you know, enrich the gardens in our community. Oh, sorry, I'm looking for the link here. And Facebook keeps giving me a really messy link that I don't like. Here we go. Here is the link. Oh, it's pretty easy anyways. You probably could have figured it out. awarewhistler.org/whistler-seed library. So there that is. So definitely if you have seeds you'd like to contribute, you can just pop by the library and ask at the front desk, and they will walk you through the process. If you're looking for seeds, you might not find a ton right now. I know there are a small number of seeds right now, but hopefully this year we'll really be able to grow the library, and by next year we'll have a really great exchange going on. Christy and Claire, thank you so much for tonight. This was illuminating. I have learned so much. Do either of you have any final words of wisdom or parting words for our guests tonight?
Put your hands in the soil. Only good will come of it.
Yeah.
Yep, that pretty much sums it up. And thank you very much for the opportunity. It's been great. And here's to a great summer.
Amen to that. Well, I think those are great words to end on. Like I said, we are going to be sharing this recording. So if you missed any of it, or if you want to share it with a friend, you will be able to do that. It'll be on our Facebook page and on our YouTube page. So you'll be able to find it in a bunch of different places. And I think we will say goodbye on that note.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye, everybody.